I'd like to start, first of all, by apologizing for this Hyperborean climate in the room. I have pinged my assistant, so hopefully we'll see an uptick in the temperature in the next few minutes. I'd like to now turn to thanking the sponsors of the speaker series for their support. They are, as we can see on the screen, Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton, Cravath, Swain, and Moore, Davis, Polk, and Wardwell, DLA Piper, Fried, Frank, Harris, Shriver, and Jacobson, Kirkland and Ellis, Latham and Watkins, Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison, Sullivan and Cromwell, Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz, Weil, Gottschall, and Manges, and White and Case. Now I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Katherine Phillips. Professor Phillips is the Reuben Mark Professor of Organizational Character and the director of the Sanford C. Berenstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. Prior to joining Columbia, she was Associate Professor of Management and Organization at the Kellogg School of Management and co-director and founder of Northwestern's Center on the Science of Diversity. Professor Phillips received her PhD in Organizational Behavior from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business. Her research addresses fundamental questions such as what is the value of diversity and what are the barriers that prevent society, organizations, and work teams from capturing the knowledge, perspectives, and unique backgrounds of every member. In addition to her many scholarly publications, Professor Phillips' research has been featured in numerous media outlets, including the Chicago Tribune, Time Magazine, and Fortune. Professor Phillips will deliver her talk, and then we will open it up for Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katherine Phillips.
Hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all for being here with us today. I'm going to take about 40 minutes or so to present to you a little journey, the journey that I've been on in studying the topic of diversity and inclusion. We're going to try to understand the value of diversity, and towards the end of the talk, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the topic of gender, which has been a really important one these days with the Me Too movement. Okay, so I started off my research career as a student at Stanford in the business school. So I have a PhD in organizational behavior. I didn't even know you could actually get a PhD from a business school, but you can. And one of the first pieces that I wrote was a big literature review. Now, I want to date myself a little bit. This paper was published in 1998, 20 years ago. And as you see the title of the paper, Demography and Diversity in Organizations, a review of 40 years of research. That means 40 years before I came into the conversation, there had already been research being done on the topic of diversity. So I want to be clear that this is not a new issue. This is an issue that we have been talking about, dealing with for a very long time, and we enter the conversation here. Now, if you were to go online and Google the topic of diversity and what is the value of diversity, you'll start to see articles that look like this one. This is from Credit Suisse. It says higher returns with women in decision-making positions, and that the research that they've done reports, it reaffirms that leadership link between gender diversity and results for the firm. There's more research. This is from McKinsey in 2015, which looks at firms and how much gender or racial diversity they have represented and how they outperform the more they have of this type of diversity. Okay, so here's a little summary. Diversity matters in organizations. You will find lots of links, hits, information on the web. Just Google it, okay? This is another piece from Dezo and Ross for S&P 1500 firms. Here's the Credit Suisse piece and the McKinsey piece. Now, these are specifically focused on issues of gender and race, okay? And one of the critical things that you'll see that kind of pops out of this research is that the word innovation tends to come up. So they'll say, you know, the first one says, especially for innovative firms. The last one also looked at innovation a little bit. And there's other research that says innovation, innovation, innovation. So in 2018, so this brings us up to date, there was a piece that was published in HBR. This is by Lorenzo and Reeves, And they created an index of diversity in the firm. And they looked at firms across the globe. And they have a total diversity index that they created, which includes gender and race, but it also includes age, migration, career path, industry, right? Lots of different kinds of diversity. And they correlate this to how much return does a firm get on innovative products. So they specifically look at a 3-year rolling window, and they say, you know, if you have more diversity in your firm of all of these different types, you're more likely to make money off of products that you've created because of your innovation that you're doing. Okay. Diversity is beneficial, okay? You can Google it, you can find lots of things. But why is this research that I've shown you so far not satisfactory to some people? People will look at this research and say, okay, but I'm really not sure if there's a value in diversity. Like, why would they do that? What's the problem? I was trained essentially as a psychologist in the business school, and I was taught to think a little bit differently about research, not just in correlation terms, but to try to understand causation. So when we say diversity is beneficial, we're basically making a causal statement. Diversity leads to some positive outcome. And the research that's been done, at least when I entered into the conversation, a lot of the research had been using correlational strategies. So they would go into a firm and they would say, can you please give us the information about the distribution of people here in your firm? And can you please give us some information about your outcomes over here at the end, your return on equity or something? And they draw a line between the two. Now, if you are an economist, many economists and others would say, well, we're not sure that that relationship is actually interpretable in the way you've interpreted. Because it's possible that what's happened is firms that are making more money, having more innovation, they are actually open to more diversity. And so it's the improved performance and innovation that begat the diversity, not the diversity that begat the improved innovation and outcomes, right? Okay. So I take a different approach to thinking about research. I'm an experimentalist, basically, in the way that I try to understand things. And my own journey with the issue of diversity was really through my own personal perspective. So I walk into a room, and in many cases, many rooms that I've been in my life since I was a little girl, I was diversifying the room. Right? There was more diversity in the room because I had entered than there was before I arrived, right? And when I heard, oh, the value of diversity, the benefit of diversity is that people who look different, look like me, are going to bring value to the bottom line of the firm. And I'm going to prove to you that that's true. Look at all this money we're making now that we've hired her. And I said, oh, wow, that's a lot of pressure. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of pressure on the shoulders of people who look different. And it actually turns out that as I started reading the research on teams and groups, that when people are in a minority position, it is really hard. It's not easy to walk into a room, be different, and voice different perspectives and have a good time in that room. It's not easy to be in that position, right? Okay, so I kind of felt like somehow when people were telling me diversity leads to more conflict, diversity leads to more conflict, which then gets us better outcomes, that somehow we were still missing a piece of the puzzle. That we were understanding this as people who look different are coming into the group, fighting with the people who were already there, and therefore that was somehow leading to better outcomes. So I actually started doing research that focused on the dynamics of the teams. What happens when people come together in a room and you can see that there are some differences amongst them on the surface, okay? I make one big assumption when I'm thinking about a team. not everybody knows the same thing. That there is some deep level diversity, some things in our heads, something that I know that you don't know, and something that you know that he doesn't know. Because in fact, we wouldn't need a team if we had all the same exact information or perspective, right? Like, why pay the people to come together and talk in a team if they don't have anything to share with each other? Okay, so I started doing these studies, and I published this paper that is also accessible if you just Google. It's called How Diversity Makes Us Smarter, and I published it in the Scientific American a few years ago. The tagline says, being around people who are different from ourselves makes us, I believe it says, harder working, more creative, more diligent, and harder working, okay? I'm gonna tell you and show you a little bit about how I came to that conclusion, and then we'll talk a little bit about why it's so hard to capture all these benefits. So here we go. The key features of these studies that I've done. Imagine that you are a participant in one of my studies. I've asked you to come and help me understand group decision making. So that's the auspices under which you're coming into the room. You think you're coming to make a group decision and learn some things about group decision making. And here are the key features. As I said, my first assumption, I actually have some control, because I'm the experimenter, over what you know. In the real world, I really don't know what you know. I might make some assumptions about what you know, but I really don't know what you know that's relevant for this task that we're working on. So I actually am able to control the information that you have access to, or I know, because I've asked you to commit to some opinion before you start talking to the other people in the room, okay? So there's some informational or opinion diversity that I can keep track of. I know exactly what you know. And then I have social category diversity or not, okay? And when I say this, what I mean is there's some surface level characteristic that is visible to everyone in the room. I've made it salient in some way or another, so that when I look at you, I make an assumption that we're different from each other because I can see this difference between us, okay? There's a surface level difference. And I've used race, basically just looking at people around the room, put them together in the team. Political affiliation, are you more of a Democrat or more of a Republican, and ask you to answer some questions about your political identification. I've used things like, what side of campus did you live on, the north side or the south side? Just so happens that on that campus, that identity was important and salient to people. And when they came in, I asked them, what side are you from? If you're from the north side, I want you over here. If you're from the south side, I want you over here. And then I put the groups together so that I either have everybody from the same side or some people from one side and some people from another, okay? That's how I create the diversity. Now, I want to point out that these studies, even though that last category says sorority and fraternity, it turns out I have never manipulated gender. So I've never looked at, in these study designs and the results I'm about to show you, I've never looked at gender in particular, okay? So it turns out that the sorority and fraternity study, either it was people from two different sororities or people from two different fraternities, but not sororities and fraternities together. So once people come in the room, they know this is my category, they read some information, they make a decision about what they think they should do. The tasks are things like, which one of these persons should we hire? Which one of these persons should we arrest because somebody's been murdered? Or which one of these companies should we acquire, using business school students? Okay, so you make your individual decision, and then you come together and you talk together in a group. You make a group decision. You have to, I tell you, I would like one group decision. You may or may not agree with it, but I need one group decision. And then I ask you some questions, where I ask you, how did it go? Please tell me, how effectively did you work together? How confident are you have the right answer? That kind of thing. So this is the results from one of those studies. There's lots of them. If you Google my name, you'll find lots of articles that'll come up. But this is what I've done in these studies. So I'm trying to figure out, does the group have the right answer? The right answer here, I know what the right answer is, because I've created the materials, right? I know what the right answer is. In the real world, how often do you actually know what the right answer is? Like, very rarely And the worlds that we're operating in, do we know exactly what the right answer is? But I know what the right answer is, and this first result tells me the percentage of groups that got it right in that category, whether it was surface level homogeneous, everybody was some from the same social category, or diverse. People are from different social categories. Now, important caveat here. Imagine that you are trying to make this choice. You have 4 options, right? Which one of these persons should I hire? There's 4 options. Which company to acquire? If you flip a coin, what percentage of people, what percentage of groups are likely to get the right answer if you just flip a coin by chance? 1 out of 4, 25%, right? You'll get it by chance. Okay, come on, my lawyers, I know you know a little tiny bit of statistics. Just a little tiny bit. You flip a coin, just randomly, if I just randomly choose one of them, I'm likely to get it right 1 out of 4 times. So what you see here is that the homogeneous groups are getting it right about 54% of the time, all right? The diverse groups are getting it right about 75% of the time. So the diverse groups are outperforming the homogeneous groups. But I'm making this point, and I want to be clear about it, because sometimes people hear me, and what they hear is homogeneity. You know, if we only have homogeneity, we're not going to make money. And then they look at their bottom line, and they say, but we made money. So what do you mean? Homogeneity is bad. It's like, I'm not saying homogeneity is bad. The groups did talk. They did figure out the answer, much more than chance. They made money. But they didn't make as much money as the diverse groups did here, okay? Now, when I asked them how well did they work together, what you see is a little bit of a rub here, okay? What you see is that the homogeneous groups tend to believe that they performed well. They tend to have an extra dose of confidence about the answer that they came up with. Now, it turns out that if you look at this closely, what you see is that the homogeneous groups, they maintain their level of confidence whether they got it right or got it wrong. The diverse groups actually move their level of confidence pretty much with their accuracy, okay? So they know when they didn't quite get it. We called this the delusions of homogeneity. The delusions of homogeneity. And that we feel like things went great. We worked great together. Okay, but I've done studies where I've asked people, so tell me how you felt about the situation, and I can look specifically at the person who had a different perspective, and they were surrounded by people who looked like them, and I know that they don't particularly feel good. They're just not saying anything about it, right? They're just not saying anything about it. So when I've done these studies, one of the key things I've found is that that idea that people who are different will bring a different perspective and therefore will have these better outcomes, there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. I come in the room, I might bring a different perspective because the reality is I've walked through the world in a different body. I've had different experiences. I've been exposed to different concerns than perhaps some of the other people in the room have been. And so indeed, it may be true. It may even be true that an engineer who's a woman and an engineer who's a man, they were both in the same classes. They were both trained by the same engineering professors. It's possible that because of the bodies they walked around the world in, they may have slightly different perspectives about this engineering problem, okay? So it's very possible that that's true. But my research also shows that it goes beyond that the value of diversity is not only because people who are different will bring different perspectives, but everybody actually starts to change their behavior when they are in a diverse environment, when they see surface level difference there in the room. I'm gonna help you understand that a little bit. Everyone changes their behavior when in the presence of that social category diversity. Here's a study that's actually not my own. This is a study that was done by Sam Summers. He's a psychologist at Tufts University. Sorry, I need to get some water. Okay, so this is a mock jury study. I thought you all might be particularly interested in this study. So this is a mock jury study. Sam was able to convince a judge in Michigan to allow him to use the courtroom next door. And when jurors were dismissed for the day, or they were told they're not needed for the jury that day, they were asked to participate in the study that Sam was doing in the room next door. And he brought them in and he exposed them to a case and he asked them to deliberate. And he took videotapes of the deliberation process. He composed the groups so that they were either all white jurors, 6 white jurors, or there were 4 white jurors and 2 African American jurors, 2 black jurors, okay? So his homogeneous groups were all white and his diverse groups were 4 white and 2 black. And then he looked at these groups to try to understand what was happening. He measured a few variables. He measured the number of novel case facts raised, the number of factual inaccuracies, and the amount of missing evidence people said, no, this evidence is missing, okay? So these are indicators of thorough deliberation, essentially, is what he's arguing. So the first thing he did was he looked within the diverse groups, and he tried to see, are the black participants and the white participants behaving any differently in the groups? And it turns out that if you look at this closely, because they all have an A next to them, the letter A, they're the same. So the black jurors and the white jurors are not particularly doing anything significantly different from each other within that group. But if you compare the white jurors within the diverse group to the white jurors who are in a homogeneous setting, there's only whites, you start to see differences emerge. So the first thing you see is the number of novel case facts raised by the whites within the diverse context is higher than the number of novel case facts in the homogeneous group. They have fewer factual inaccuracies, and they ask more questions about where's the missing evidence when they're in the diverse group. So Sam, he concluded that there's something going on such that the white jurors are behaving differently when they're in the diverse group than when they're in a group where there's only whites. And this was great for me. I love this study because it dovetails so nicely with the work that I had been doing too. Okay, so we were finding converging information. Now, if you go a little bit deeper, I had this amazing student who said to me, well, how do you know that this deliberation process, that the effects of diversity only happen when people come together and start talking to each other? Maybe the effects actually start happening even before people start communicating with each other in the group. And it turns out that there was a paper that was done that looked at something that they called mere presence. What they did here was they asked people, white people, only white people, to participate in their study. And those people came into the study and they said, what is your viewpoint on the death penalty, for instance? And then they exposed them to a different perspective, a minority viewpoint that either came from a fellow white student or they said that same viewpoint came from a black student. What they found was the participants deliberated more deeply. They had what they call more integrative complexity when they wrote out an essay of this is my beliefs about the death penalty after they heard that dissenting perspective from an African American, from a black student, than when they heard it from a white. It's like the same ideas, the same information was being filtered through this black body, and when it was, it made you think about the issues more deeply, more complexly. So we did a paper where we looked at Democrat versus Republican, and we also did some minimal distinction, just like red versus blue, randomly selected. And we found something similar, that diversity affects your processing of information even before you enter the room. So if I tell you, you will be entering a room to talk to this person, I come in the room, you have on your Democrat badge, and I come in the room and I say, you will be talking to a person in a few minutes, but we're interested in written communication and verbal communication, so before they come in, I want you to write down and prepare for the meeting, right? And I come in the room, and I put a nameplate on the table across from you. Boom, it says Republican, or boom, it says Democrat, fellow Democrat or a Republican who's different from yourself, let's say. You can viscerally see people's bodies change depending upon which nameplate you put on the table. And let me be clear, the task that they were working on had nothing to do with identity of your political affiliation. Okay? The task had nothing to do with political affiliation, but they still felt like, ugh, can't believe I'm going to have to talk to this person who's different from me. What we found was basically that diversity jolts us into cognitive action even prior to the actual interaction. It makes us start to think more deeply about the problem even before we have the interaction with the person who looks different from us. Okay, so these were the results. We had greater, what we called pre-meeting elaboration, and that was directly linked to better performance for the diverse teams. Thought about the problem more deeply, therefore, you were better able to solve it. Okay? All right, so here's a summary of the value of diversity. And I hope I've convinced you in the few minutes I've been up here that there is some value in diversity, that people who are different do bring different perspectives to the table, and that can be valuable, but that indeed it also changes the dynamic within the room so that everybody is thinking more deeply about the problem. So that social category diversity, seeing difference on the surface, legitimates the presence of different deeper level perspectives and information. It enhances that pre-meeting elaboration and integrative complexity. We know that it also increases perspective taking. We have Adam Galinsky here in the room who's done some of that work. Creativity, and I have a study that shows even effort is changed when you're working with somebody who's different from you. People work harder, okay? But we are cognitive misers. This basically means that we are lazy. We don't want to work so hard, and we may not feel so satisfied by the process. So I've been studying diversity for a long time, and when I first came into the conversation, there was a whole lot of conversation about convincing people at the top of firms to care about these issues. And coming from a business school, the whole business case for diversity, finding the value of diversity, it was logical that, in fact, people would be asking us to prove to them, given the fact that they had a stakeholder perspective. They wanted to make money. They had to prove that they were making money. That's why the question was being asked. I've had a lot of people say to me, well, Professor Phillips, why shouldn't we do diversity just because it's the right thing to do? Why are you even asking the question of what is the value of diversity? Why is that even the approach that is being taken? And I can take you on a history lesson, right, of why that question is being asked. But this is the journey that we've been on trying to think about what is that value of diversity. How do we convince people? How do we motivate people to get engaged and involved, right? So I want to use a little analogy here for you that works for me. It helps me as I think about this issue. Now, how many of you go to the gym? Just raise your hand. Go to the gym. So I really shouldn't be raising my hand because I don't really go to the gym too often. I go for walks and go for little jogs, but I don't go to the gym nearly as much as I probably should. But when we think about this, when we go to the gym or when we go for a workout, we are specifically intentional about what we're looking for. We go to the gym to get uncomfortable. We go to the gym to find pain. That's why we go to the gym. We want to feel the twinge in our muscle that tells us that we're getting good reps in, and if we don't sweat, you can go to the gym. You can put on your workout clothes, which I do many mornings, and you can go to the gym, and you can stand around in the gym and talk to people and say, hey, I went to the gym today, and it would be true. You did go to the gym today. But you go to the gym actually looking for discomfort. You go to the gym looking to grow, to learn, to develop, to get better, to improve. I see diversity the same way. We should be entering into diverse environments, looking for change, looking to grow, looking to develop, looking for a little bit of pain, knowing that there's going to be some discomfort. And that discomfort, the very discomfort that we feel, is exactly what's getting us the benefit. It's what's helping us to grow and develop, right? So next time you go to the gym, You can just stand around in the gym and do nothing, but you won't be getting your money's worth, right? Let me tell you one more thing that might help with making this real for you. For the teams that I've studied, usually when I bring people into those studies, it's like an hour long, and I'm paying people to participate. Let's say I'm paying you, $15 for the hour. Years ago, it was only $10 for the hour. Now it's probably $20 for the hour. The groups have like 30 minutes to deliberate, to talk, to come up with the right answer. And it doesn't really matter how long they take, they're always going to be paid. On average, in that study I showed you, the homogeneous groups took about 16 minutes on average. The diverse groups, they deliberated for about 24 minutes on average. You're paying the homogeneous groups the same amount of money. They walked away with my money feeling very confident and happy that they had worked well together, and in fact, they didn't perform as well as they thought they did. So one of the things I'm trying to tell you and trying to help organizations understand is that their strategy of diversifying their firm is an effort to improve their firms and should fit into the strategy that they have in place. That diversity actually should be an opportunity for growth, for innovation, for change. If they're not looking for growth and innovation and change, and they're bringing in diversity, they may not get any benefits from it. And in fact, it may be very hard, right? It may be very hard. Okay, so let's talk about gender, because I promised you that we would take a close look at gender during this presentation. And I've thought about gender a lot during my career, but haven't done a whole lot of research. I mentioned that all those studies that I showed you, none of them had actually had gender in the studies. So the question is all of this true for gender? And I would argue that it can be. Now, when I wrote the Scientific American paper, I got a call from one of the leading gender experts in the world. And she said, "How could you have possibly published this article?" I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm getting a call from the leading gender scholar in the world, and she's chastising me for writing this article. I thought, oh my God, I gotta do something about this. Now, one of the things she pointed out to me is that there had been meta-analyses done, and a meta-analysis is basically taking as many as possible of the papers that have been published and papers that have not made it to publication, that have looked at this issue of the gender diversity and performance. And they gathered all these papers, and they take all of the, what we call effect sizes, like, is it significant or not? And they put them all together, and the more effect sizes you have, the more powerful your meta-analysis is, and you can make a strong statement that, oh, this gender diversity, is it really beneficial or not? So she called me, and she said, did you see the meta-analysis that was done on gender diversity? It actually shows, from 71 independent samples, 68 studies from almost 20 years of time, that gender diversity is bad. So how could you publish this article about the value of diversity if gender diversity is bad? And I said to my, I was scared on the phone, like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Did I do something really wrong here? And so I started digging into it a little bit more. Now, what it showed was a significant negative relationship between gender diversity and performance, but they had two caveats in the paper. They found that there were two, what we call moderators, certain conditions under which you could find either a neutral or positive relationship between diversity and performance for gender. And it was these two things, gender egalitarianism and collectivism. Gender egalitarianism being a context in which we believe that men and women are equal, essentially, and collectivism being we actually have an identity as we, that we care about us, essentially. Okay, in-group collectivism, it turns out. All right, so I went back to my own work, and I started thinking about, okay, Kathy, what do you know about gender, and how do you reconcile what you have done in your research on gender and what you've done in your research on these other things. And I went back to my own work and I found this paper. It's like, oh yeah, I remember this paper. This was one of the first empirical papers and one of the only empirical papers I've done on gender. And it turns out that it was pretty sad, this gender study. The title of the paper, When What You Know Is Not Enough, Expertise in Gender Dynamics in Task Groups. So we actually pulled together a bunch of participants who are in mixed gender groups, and they were doing this bushfire survival task. And this is one of these survival tasks. They have these, some of you are shaking your head, you're familiar with these tasks. These basically ask you, how would you rank these 10 items that you have access to in terms of the importance for your survival in a bushfire, or in terms of the importance for your survival in the desert, okay, these kind of things. And what we know is that men and women are actually equally expert on this task. People believe men are better at it, but it actually turns out that there's no a priori performance difference between men and women on rank ordering these items, okay? So we put them together in groups, and we identified male experts and non-experts, female experts and female non-experts. The experts were simply people who had performed better than everybody else in the group on the task before they started talking to each other, right? Here's the sad part. When you do research on diversity, gender, race, whatever it is, your findings are what your findings are. So we published our findings. They were what they were. We found that female experts perceived by others, they felt themselves, and they actually had less influence than the male experts did. And this was the kicker. They actually felt like they had less expertise, were perceived as having less expertise, and had less influence than their female non-expert counterparts. So women who knew more actually had less impact on the group. And their teams ended up performing worse if they had a female expert than if they had a male expert. These findings were saddening because part of what we were arguing and thinking, right, it's like, well, just send the women just go to school, go to NYU, go to law school, get your degree, just have the expertise that's necessary, and the problem will be over. It's like, no, doesn't work like that, not at all. In fact, this is more of a problem here. Okay, we know it's a problem in STEM. This is another piece that I did that looks at women in STEM, especially women of color in STEM, telling us how they have to prove themselves again and again, over and over. This is collaborative work with Joan Williams on the prove it again bias, where you're asking people whether you have to repeatedly prove yourself to get the same level of respect and recognition as your colleagues. That's the first set of bars is from engineers, and the second set is from lawyers, where female lawyers and lawyers of color are saying, yes, I have to prove myself over and over and over again, right? Okay, so what's the upside here, right? How do we actually increase the likelihood that we can consistently get benefits of diversity from gender in our organizations? Because remember the opening studies that I showed you, where they're looking at boards and top management teams, and they're showing all of these positive effects of gender diversity. So something's happening, something kind of correlation is occurring there, right? I want to be clear here. Diversity is not the problem. Diversity is not the problem. The problem is the status differences, the lack of respect, right? My colleague would call it power. The problem is not the diversity, okay? So when you look at the research and you start to try to summarize, what do we actually know about the factors that are necessary to help groups get the benefits of diversity? There's three things I want you to remember, okay? First of all, you shouldn't always expect benefits of diversity everywhere. So making blanket statements that diversity is always going to be beneficial for something down the road is a tricky statement to make. Here's why. Because I'm not saying that you shouldn't always have diversity. I'm saying you shouldn't always expect it's going to be directly linked to your bottom line over here. It's circumstances under which integration of unique information is needed, innovation, creativity. You're looking for people to learn and grow. If people aren't open to change, if people aren't open to innovation, the likelihood that they're going to get some benefits of that diversity, really small, okay? You have to have a compelling shared goal. In all the studies that I did, it was very clear why the people were in the room. They were in the room to solve a problem. They were in the room to come to some kind of joint conclusion about things. They weren't there to make sure that their idea won. They were there to solve the problem. So if the framing that you have there is really important. And they had an identity as a group, we. There was a collective orientation. And egalitarianism is super important. You have to minimize status differences between people in a group if you expect them to learn from one another. There's lots of studies that support this idea that equality of airtime is important, that norms of having low status people speaking up and no interruption, important. And there's a study that was done by a group of political scientists that was really compelling to me. There's other work out there that I haven't pointed out here, but this unanimity rule, they actually dovetails very nicely with the jury studies. If you think about a jury, the jury usually has a unanimity rule. Everybody in the room has to vote. Everybody has an equal vote. I have just as much power as you do because my vote is just as important as yours. It has the same amount of cachet, the same weighting in that room. They actually found in this study when they had gender diversity that when the group had a unanimity rule, it was better able to benefit from the gender diversity in the room than when it had a majority rule that it was using, okay? So it matters the context that you bring people into. We know that if you don't pay attention to the dynamics of that room, if you don't create the situation that's necessary for people to actually learn and hear from each other, the benefits of diversity are not nearly as likely to emerge. Okay, how am I doing on time, Kenji? Because I have no idea. I'm supposed to stop right about now. Yeah, okay, perfect. Perfect. So I'm gonna stop with this. So you all probably remember the full 10-page diversity screed that was written by one of the employees at Google talking about basically how the company was overzealous about their efforts to diversify on the basis of gender. And so one of the things that I want to say here is that gender norm expectations, the roles that we expect women to take, have been very much reified in our society over many, many years. In fact, when you leave this room to go to the restroom, you'll be reminded of your gender. We are reminded of our gender all the time. And we are reminded that girls are supposed to be a certain way and boys are supposed to be another way. We teach our girls and our boys that they're supposed to be certain ways. The Me Too movement, right, has really raised our antennas about how these gender norm expectations are so reified in the power structures in our organizations, so much so that people actually find themselves harassed and assaulted to keep people, this gender hierarchy, the way it is. And so part of what's happening right now in our society is a change. I think of it as like a big ball that we've been pushing up a hill. Pushing up the hill, and then what happens is people start to push back. That's what we see here from the Google piece. So we've been doing research trying to understand what happens when you get to the top of that hill and people start to push back. What is the importance of the social movement in our society? How does it actually change our opportunities to benefit from diversity? It turns out that the studies that have been done on juries with race, I think partially benefit from the fact that we've had a civil rights movement in this United States and that racism is not an acceptable thing, at least it had not been. We could talk about that. But there is research that shows that whites do not want to be perceived as racist, that will make them feel like they're immoral or something. They're concerned about being seen as racist. And so the question that I have is, will we also see people being concerned about being seen as sexist and perhaps be more diligent? So people have asked me, is it a good thing that we're having this Me Too movement? Is it a good thing that men are scared, they don't want to go out to dinner with women? Isn't that a problem? And I've actually said to people, I don't feel sorry for the men, absolutely not. We are changing, and I would like to believe that if I go out to dinner, I won't be harassed. And I would like them to also believe that if I go out to dinner with them, I will not be harassed. So ultimately, we need a new norm, a new expectation. And gender has been, I think, sticky in that way. So when I look at these studies and I look at what we know about this, it leads to those questions, right? And that work that we all have to do to make sure that we're getting the benefits from diversity. So I'm gonna stop there and I'm gonna open it up for conversation and for questions. I'm sure you all have things on your mind, reactions, perspectives that you'd like to share. And we are recording this, so I'm gonna make sure that I pass the microphone to you so that the camera can actually, or somebody's gonna pass the microphone to you to make sure that the camera captures your voice. So if you don't mind, there's a couple hands here in the front, and then I see one there. Raise your hands high for me, just so I can see a little bit. So I see 1 and 2. Was there another one? Okay, go ahead, please.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes. I also don't feel bad for those men who don't go out to the dinners, et cetera. Just picking up on that last point you mentioned. I do view it as a bad thing, though, but not from their perspective. It's more, some of those men need to be part of the conversation and need to be creating opportunities for women who, I'm sorry to say it, still to this day, we rely on opportunities being given by old white men. Mm-hmm. And so if they take themselves out of that circle, they're, I think, only hurting those women.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. So let me say the following. There's a couple things. Number one, I agree with you, absolutely. And we need to recognize that diversity itself is about all of us. So one of the things that's a pet peeve of mine is when we use language that basically says diverse people. We need to have more diverse people here. Part of the reason why that's a problem is because we're using that word to fill in for non-white, non-male, non-cisgender, et cetera. And it basically makes people who are part of those majority categories feel like this conversation is not about them and that they're not a part of it. So I think it is really important for us to be careful about how we say these things and to be careful about making sure that everybody feels that it's in their interest to be a part of the conversation, right? And so I really appreciate your points, really very important. There's actually an article that I read just this morning that I'll point out to you guys. It was an HBR that was published by a woman named Lily Zhang. And this person wrote a piece about getting white men involved in the conversation. So I encourage you to Google it. I tweeted about it this morning, which I don't typically tweet very much, but that piece was very compelling to me. Please.
Thank you. Back to your discussion about the unanimity rule and having more egalitarianism in organizations. I come from a law firm, and I know many of us in here do. They are, by definition, structurally created as a hierarchy where your title comes before your name, comes before your race, comes before your gender. Are you an associate? Are you a partner? And that in itself seems to create a completely different conversation when it comes to weighing the status and valuing the opinions. And somebody shouldn't even speak up in a literally shouldn't even open their mouths, no matter what color or gender or social status they are. And so I mean, I've been in firms for 20 years, observing how this operates, and I don't know. I mean, I kicked off and founded the Latin America Women's Initiative at my firm, and we have a mentoring program, and we've done this all outside the framework of what the firm's foundations are and what our administrative principles are. So how is it that we could even possibly change the conversation when it comes to conference rooms, when it comes to getting female associates or associates of color on more pitches and RFPs, and on these client service teams? Like, how do we even start that conversation?
This is a really great question. I've actually had the opportunity to spend some time in law firms, so I know exactly what you mean. And I've heard this before. It's like, what do you mean? We are a hierarchy. That's how it's supposed to be. And the idea that we would listen to those who are lower status in any dimension. We don't listen to anybody of lower status, independent of their race and gender. And imagine how difficult then it becomes for the person who is not only of lower status, but they also are of underrepresented gender and race in the context as well. Makes it even harder. So where do you start? I think you have to start by recognizing exactly what you just said. One of the things about organizations is that people in the firm, people in the organization, they are absolutely going to be affected by the structures that you have surrounding them, by the culture that you have surrounding them, even by the way you define and do the work that you have in the firm. And so one of the things I tell organizations, not just law firms, is that if you want to diversify, you have to think about the rest of the organization. You cannot expect to just bring in different people, but keep everything else the same and expect it's going to work. It doesn't actually make sense. Every organization is created for the people that's in them. It's created with some societal expectations in mind. It's created under particular circumstances. And law firms are created the way that they were created for particular reasons. You could do, I don't know, why? Why are they created the way they are? What is it that the firm is trying to protect? Why does it have such a hierarchy in the first place, right? And until you are able and ready to do that kind of deep thinking about who you are, how you are, why you are, then the likelihood that you can just swap out a few people of the majority group with a few people in some other group and expect it to work is not going to happen, right? I tell people all the time, it's not going to happen. Sometimes firms say they want to diversify. They want more gender. They want more racial diversity. Ultimately, what I hear is you want a clone of the people who are already there in brown or in a skirt. If that's what you want, the likelihood that you're going to have change, innovation, difference is very small. You have to be open and willing to do the exact examination that you've been talking about here today. And so ultimately, I think until the law firm does that, until you recognize, well, actually, how about we start by creating some context in our firm where we can all be equal, where actually we're going to have a meeting today, maybe the first half of the meeting, maybe 10 minutes of the meeting is for everybody to speak up and have some opportunity to share their perspectives. Maybe you create that environment for that to happen. And until you do that, it's probably not going to happen, and it's especially not going to happen for the people who are outside of the norm, right? Yeah, it's a great question. Yes?
It seems to me that even the research is somewhat segregated. It's either diversity research or it's gender research. And I was wondering if there's research on women of color in particular. And speaking for myself, I've been engaged in this project. I'm a judge. I've been engaged in this project to create a diversity pipeline. Because we've been complaining about the lack of diverse candidates for judgeships, for legal profession, for law schools. And so the idea is to bring diverse high school students into the courts. I brought 100 of them last week. And I will say most of them were young women of color. And the idea is to increase that pipeline. I was wondering if you had any ideas about doing that, and also about whether there's research about women of color in particular.
Great. There is, in fact, as you all may have heard, the word intersectionality is becoming much more popular word these days. Kimberly Crenshaw is a colleague of mine at Columbia in the law school. And she has been talking about this question, this issue of making sure that we identify and think about, right, all groups of people, especially people that fall into these intersectional categories, right, the women of color, for instance. There was an article on September 9th in the Washington Post that showed that the number of people entering into the workplace today, that the people of color has just slightly surpassed non-people of color, right, whites. It's really interesting to think about because ultimately it suggests that change is still coming, right? It's not equally distributed in our organizations, as you just pointed out, but that it is an issue that we have to definitely continue to think about. So I think we have to be specific in ways that you are just talking about, being having structures and perspectives that include everybody in the conversation. And you're right, we in our research haven't done a fantastic job at this, but we are starting to do a better job at it. There is more research out there that has looked at people of color. There's research that suggests women of color in particular are not listened to in groups, but there's also research that suggests that women of color are important and that they do speak up and that they do have opportunities to have their voices heard. And so there's more work that's needed, definitely, on the topic. And more opportunity because it definitely is like the wave of the future. Because that article in the Washington Post actually said that most of those people of color that are entering into the workforce are women. Yeah.
So I work for a big tech company, and I see that there is some structure in place in terms of learning about different communities other than your own. It's great that they provide that, yet I often also see that people don't mark it as accepted on their calendars. It's often ignored, overlooked. Oh, I have things that are going on. Oh, I'm gonna leave work early that day. Regardless of where that's coming from, it's always seen as optional. And unless you're someone like me who actually helps further that diversity and inclusion work for the company, people don't really seem to make it a priority. And I was wondering if you had research that I would love to hear about or other ways to make people feel like it is more of their responsibility. And I say this regardless of race or gender for people involved. I personally, anecdotally, haven't really seen that be a typical trait of just white men or just whomever. It just seems to be, if you're not involved for the company, you don't really care.
Yes, okay, this is the last question. Thank you so much. It's a great question and a great way for us to end because ultimately it is about figuring out how do we motivate people to care, right, to be engaged, to be involved. Motivation is a really tricky thing, right, because people will do what you motivate them to do, what you reward them to do. And otherwise, if they don't have to do it, they oftentimes won't, right? And so I think it is important to figure out how do we help people understand that this is important for them, that it's part of, should be seen as part of who they are and that it'll be beneficial to them in some way, which is why that whole conversation about the value of diversity is still ongoing, right? Still ongoing. So one of the hardest questions I've ever gotten is how do you motivate white men to participate? Which is why I think that piece by Lily Zhang was so powerful to me this morning. So the piece basically kind of says that you have to actually appeal to those people on the basis, kind of meet them where they are, essentially. That the example that was given, and I'll share this and then I'm done. The example that was given was a husband saying that his wife was telling him how hard it is in the organization to make it, that it's hard to succeed, et cetera. And the husband was thinking, no, this is how it works. It just, you do all these things. And then what Lily Zhang said was, well, she said to the man, you actually are an expert. You know how this firm works for men. And your wife understands how this firm works for women. So it's actually really important for both of you to be in the conversation because you can share things with each other that then you can each learn from, right? And so it was really about not making that man feel bad because he was saying, oh no, things are great. It's like, actually things are great for men, right? And so actually trying to help him understand that his identity is actually important and centered in the way he understands the world, in the same way that my identity is important and centered in the way I understand the world. And until we both kind of get there and understand that, it's going to be hard to motivate both of us to be in the conversation. So that was part of the article that really stood out to me. There's more in there. I really encourage you to look at that piece. And we have to keep thinking about it and working on this. I'm glad you all were here today, because the reality is I'm just one person. I've been studying and working on this for many years. I do not have all the solutions. We need really smart people with big brains and lots of, time on their hands, young people, to think about these things, right? And to work on it, right? And to really try to figure out how do we continue to make change happen around us. So I thank you for the work that you're doing in your firm. And I thank you all for being here today, for sharing with us. And I hope that it's sparked some opportunities and some thoughts in your minds that will help us as we continue to move forward. Thank you.